In Final Fantasy VII, as with most other role-playing games of its kind, the player will command their party in countless battles. Damage is both dealt and incurred, and as stats increase on both the player and enemy sides over the course of one's playtime, the numerical value of this damage increases. In the beginning, the player deals and receives a couple dozen points of damage at a time, whereas by the end, the player is regularly trading numbers in the high thousands. You get the sense that the stakes are raised not only by seeing higher damage values, but also by way of the game's presentation. The simpler combat animations of the early game, or of the game's less threatening enemies, give way to lengthier and more daunting ones seen in battle with stronger enemies and bosses. Similarly, the limit breaks and summons which the player gains access to become more lethal looking later on. The player might reflect somewhere along the way on how far their party has come. The damage dealt and the skills they employed in the early game seem so quaint compared to the flashier, higher value ones they've learned through level ups, item and materia usage, and story progression. All of this, of course, is a collective abstraction used to suggest the idea that your characters are fighting battles and growing stronger. Real-life combat can be seen as a back and forth, a trading of blows. Combatants' health, energy, stamina, and other attributes are typically depleted over time. There is a cost to taking action. When a combatant has nothing left to give, they are out of the fight in one way or another. Over time, you would expect fighters to improve their skills by repetition, so repeatedly fighting battles levels up your characters, makes them stronger, and grants them access to new skills. The battles seen in role-playing games like Final Fantasy VII are, more transparently than in other games, just complicated math equations that the player helps formulate via their inputs, complete with a bit of probability in the form of critical hits, enemy AI, and other chance-based elements to liven things up. All of that said, this abstraction can be difficult to get a feel for. For anyone unfamiliar with role-playing games in this style, it can feel jarring to boot up Final Fantasy VII and watch Cloud survive a hail of machine gun fire. Players might wonder why swords are frequently hitting for more damage than bullets. A lengthy animation might play out that suggests that your character has been decimated, only for it to end and for your character to take a surprisingly low amount of damage. Characters can be inflicted with status changes, but there is no wounded or injured state of low hit points that prevents your character from acting to their fullest potential when it's their turn. Anything they can do with full hit points, they can also do at just one hit point, so long as they're not knocked out. Phoenix Downs, life spells, and so on are revival methods that really just flip characters from one binary state to the other. Either they're knocked down or they're active. This is all well and good. Any game you play, and really any work of art, is going to need you to meet it on its terms in order to connect with it. So there's nothing wrong with Final Fantasy VII having its own kind of visual language to accompany its gameplay mechanics. It takes some time to parse what you're seeing and experiencing and figure out where you need to suspend your disbelief to best appreciate the game. At the end of Disc 1 of Final Fantasy VII, one of your party members, Aerith Gainsborough, is suddenly killed in a surprise attack by the game's villain, Sephiroth. This comes as a shock for many reasons. In terms of story, Aerith was arguably main character Cloud's primary love interest, and the optimistic, outgoing counterbalance to his cold and closed-off personality. She was also the last of the Cetra, an ancient race of people with a strong connection to the now-dying planet. Meta-narratively speaking, it was rare at the time, and still is today, for a playable character to be permanently killed off. A playable character represents a lot of hard work on behalf of the development team. It is no small sacrifice for all of Aerith's combat balancing, abilities, animations, custom equipment, narrative potential, and more to get nixed partway through the game. Not to mention, the player may feel betrayed to see a character they've grown attached to, and spent time developing, arbitrarily be made inaccessible all of a sudden. Aerith's absence is felt by the player both from a gameplay perspective in that her healing abilities are no longer accessible in battle, and also from a story perspective in that the party has to soldier on without her optimistic outlook. The game's strong commitment to using no part of the various elements that comprise Aerith for the rest of the gameplay experience is commendable. Her stats and abilities are not transplanted onto another character as in Final Fantasy V. The player is unable to go on an optional side quest to resurrect her as in Chrono Trigger. In other words, there's no bargaining with the game. Her death is as sudden and as final as death often feels in real life. But paired with the way that the game depicts violence in its gameplay situations, this scene where Aerith is stabbed by Sephiroth might not be as effective as it could be. In gameplay scenarios, the characters regularly get hit with volleys of bullets and missiles and lasers, they get slashed and sawed and pummeled, Crushed, burned, electrocuted, poisoned, hit with magical attacks from giant monsters, there's never any visual or mechanical indication that they are coming to any lasting bodily harm. At worst, characters get knocked out and only need an item administered or a spell cast before they get back up and are combat ready again. The game plays pretty fast and loose with how much punishment these characters can take. And yet, in this cutscene, Aerith is run through with Sephiroth's sword, and she's meant to be seen in that moment as killed with no possibility of revival. A few things work to drive home the fact that Aerith is really dead here. First, for all of the damaging attacks the player has seen their characters endure, none of them have involved getting impaled. Second, getting impaled is one of the more lethal looking things that can happen to a person. There's nothing cartoony about it. I wouldn't be surprised if a longsword was considered a crucial part of Sephiroth's concept for the express purpose of making Aerith's death more obvious. Third, non-player character deaths which the player has witnessed include the Shinra president, who was also impaled by Sephiroth's sword, making for a lethal early example of a stabbing. In fact, the player already associates Sephiroth with murder after seeing the aftermath of his tear through Shinra Corporation, in which he left a trail of blood in his wake. However, other character death examples include Avalanche members dying from gunfire or falling from great heights, which might muddy the waters a bit in the player's mind. And fourth, the scenes that follow Aerith's death are presented as Cloud and the party coming to terms with her passing, and laying her to rest in the lifestream, so the game is doing its best to treat her death as obvious and final. But at the same time, the playable characters by this point seem to possess superhuman strength and resilience. As far as the game is concerned, items and spells seem to be the solution to any conceivable health problem. The character's summons and abilities seem eye-wateringly powerful at times. Other non-player characters have died in the game, but it's possible that they simply weren't as strong or didn't have the superhuman resilience that the playable characters demonstrate. Why does being stabbed mean Aerith is instantly and irreversibly dead? Whenever the party has encountered danger, the game has launched into a battle screen where the player has a chance to fight their way out of it, so why not this time? Is there an on-screen depiction of death that would make more immediate sense than the way Aerith's death was handled? With the player having witnessed the characters enduring such exaggerated levels of punishment for so long, and looking none the worse for wear, can the player accept these characters and situations as analogous to real life anymore? Aerith's death by stabbing is instant and irreversible because it is. The writers wanted her death to happen for story reasons, and so it does. But perhaps it didn't have to feel so arbitrary, so in conflict with what the game has taught you to expect about what the playable characters can withstand in Final Fantasy VII. In Red Dead Redemption, player character John Marston can only take a few bullets in short succession before dying, even on the lowest difficulty setting. While his health is restored with superhuman speed in just a few seconds after last getting shot, the player at least always feels intuitively that he is decently vulnerable, that if he's surrounded by too many gunslingers with nowhere to take cover, there's no way out of that situation. And this is precisely how the game ends. In the last scene of John Marston's story, he steps out of his barn to confront soldiers and lawmen who have been sent to kill him, and the player assumes control. Even though the game launches you into his slow-motion Deadeye gunslinger mode, the situation feels hopeless to the player. The odds are stacked too highly against John, and all he can do is go down after taking as many enemies as he can with him. To me, John's death makes good sense within the logic of the game. His death is effective on a narrative level, but from a gameplay perspective, the game is able to put the player in control of John for his last moments, a rare thing in itself, in a situation that the player undoubtedly knows by now is inescapable. While the player is in control, John takes damage the player knows is lethal. The situation is contrived for story purposes, but the depiction does not feel at odds with what the player has experienced up to that point. The narrative and the gameplay align so that John's death feels appropriate from both angles. I feel that this is what Final Fantasy VII is lacking in its gameplay. Any real sense of mortal danger for your playable characters until it comes time for Aerith to die. Your party witnesses other characters die, but it may just feel like they aren't taken from the same stock as your party members. Your playable characters sometimes go down in battle and the player gets a game over screen, but you may think you've only lost because your playable characters can't revive each other. In my experience, this all conspired to lessen the impact of Aerith's death, at least a little. I'd be lying to myself if I said it didn't. I really like Final Fantasy VII. I consider it one of my favorite games. I've played it several times, and I always have a great time going back to it. I bring up Aerith's death to say that I feel that a game built around such a real and shocking twist could be designed to be even more effective, if the player is conditioned through gameplay to feel that in that moment, the character is really dead and gone. In Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, you play primarily as Jack Raiden, a rookie agent on his first mission after completing virtual training simulations. Raiden is tasked with infiltrating the Big Shell oil rig and saving several hostages, including the United States President, from a terrorist group known as the Sons of Liberty. Among the members of this terrorist group are an elite team called Dead Cell, whose members are highly idiosyncratic, superpowered, and all-around larger-than-life villains. Perplexingly, the terrorist group's leader is said to be Solid Snake, the hero from the previous game, Metal Gear Solid. Anyone who played that game may notice that Raiden's mission closely resembles that of Solid Snake up to a certain point. That point comes when it is revealed that almost nothing is as it seems here. Some of the big reveals are that the Big Shell location isn't really an oil rig, but an underwater fortress housing a super AI called GW. That all Great World affairs are orchestrated by a clandestine group called the Patriots, and that Dead Cell's leader is not Solid Snake, but Solidus Snake, his brother, in the sense that they were both cloned from the same soldier. Perhaps the most earth-shattering revelation for Raiden comes when a virus his team uploads to GW is able to partially damage the AI. The people he has been digitally communicating with throughout the game via codec calls, namely Colonel Roy Campbell, his commanding officer, and Rosemary, an analyst and Raiden's girlfriend, begin to exhibit uncanny behavior on their calls. Raiden learns that for some time the GW AI has been impersonating the Colonel and Rose, meaning that he has been carrying out the mission of the AI all along. This leads Raiden to learn that he's been manipulated by the GW AI to confront and kill Solidus, who he learns is the closest thing he has to a father. While not a purely good person, Solidus has the noble goal of destroying the AI superpower that controls the world. By the time Raiden learns the truth, it's too late. Raiden has to kill Solidus, or the AI will kill innocent hostages, including his girlfriend Rosemary. Solidus has to kill Raiden to learn the information that would help him defeat the clandestine group that runs world affairs. In the end, Raiden is forced to kill his own foster father, knowingly fulfilling his role in the AI's plan. The story of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty touches on many other topics as well, but hopefully that brief recap provides context for what I'd like to talk about with regard to my experience with the game. The story of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty features many rug pulls, which, when altogether considered, seriously call into question the entire premise. Raiden is a person who is essentially reprogrammed, causing him to lose memories of his early life and become a blank slate of a soldier. VR training simulations conditioned him to follow orders from his superiors and imparted him with instincts for combat. If the entire Big Shell was only a stage, what parts of this mission were real? Did Raiden do the right thing, and if so, according to whom? Does your early life matter if you've forgotten all of it? Does blindly following orders exonerate you from doing something morally wrong? Back in the late 2010s, my brother got really into the Metal Gear series, starting with Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, and after that he went through the Solid series in order. I got around to all of them as well, and was eager to play Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, as this one was my brother's favorite. I like the game, and while The Phantom Pain is my favorite by far in terms of gameplay, I do enjoy the first two Solid games a good deal as well. When I first played this game, my immediate thought was that it seemed like a missed opportunity to not allow the player to affect the outcomes of the story in any way. And I still think this today, but at the same time, I don't hold it against the game. Hideo Kojima's games are often likened to movies, given that the player watches hours of in-game and pre-rendered cutscenes play out, with no opportunity for player input at all. But really, while Kojima does take this to lengthier extremes than most, games have done this for a long time. The player will overcome a series of interactive challenges in the gameplay segments, and then the story will move along in non-interactive cutscenes, and then that cycle repeats until the game ends. And if you think about it, most of the time what you're doing mechanically in the interactive segments has little to do with the story segments. My thought was, if Raiden's story is about learning that his foundational beliefs about his origin, his mission, the world, are all a lie, doesn't it make sense to give the player options to play through the game and make different choices? There are many hints in the early game that something is amiss, that all is not as it seems, so it doesn't seem fair for attentive players to notice these things and not be able to act on them. The ending of the story is essentially a tragedy where Raiden kills his only family and protects a dystopian status quo. And yet, in spite of a bit of playful fourth wall breaking from time to time, and endgame lectures that seem directed to the player through Raiden on how to live and act in a world with so much conflicting information, the player is funneled into this tragic outcome every single time they play. If I wanted to craft a generous summary of the message of this game, it would go something like this. Terrible things can result from a lack of skepticism. Raiden unwittingly carried out a mission which he later realized was morally wrong once he understood the bigger picture. This should serve as a reminder to the player to do their best to identify misinformation and act accordingly. While the game itself doesn't allow the player to meaningfully act on the misinformation they identify, the game also doesn't really shame the player or see them as responsible for Raiden's missteps. This brings me to another game that works in the same vein as Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. In Spec Ops: The Line, the player controls Captain Martin Walker, who disobeys orders to leave combat in Dubai. He instead decides to locate Colonel John Conrad, a rogue soldier who also disobeyed orders to leave Dubai when sandstorms hit the area. Lots of rumors circulate about how his damned 33rd Infantry Unit have been committing atrocities on the local population. But over the course of the game, the player learns that the damned 33rd deserters have only been trying to provide aid to civilians and protect them from insurgents and CIA operatives. Through a series of assumptions and miscommunications, Captain Walker ends up killing a lot of the wrong people. In a pivotal moment of the game, he uses white phosphorus to kill dozens of damned 33rd soldiers, and at the same time, he mistakenly massacres 47 civilians. The white phosphorus scene is preceded by a beat in which the supporting characters ask if Captain Walker, or the player if you prefer, really wants to use such a deadly weapon. One character says there's always a choice, to which the captain replies, no, there's really not. The choice that the game alludes to here is to either press the button and continue the game, or to turn the game off and never play it again. There is no other choice to be made. The player cannot turn back, cannot decide to wait and learn more about the situation, cannot surrender themselves to those they perceive as the enemy, nothing. Any discomfort or uncertainty that the player feels can't be validated by the game. It can't be acted upon in any meaningful way. In the hours leading up to the white phosphorus reveal, if you're skeptical about the situation, if you're taking the story seriously and don't want to make any rash combat decisions, or if you've just played the game before and know that you're about to massacre civilians, it ultimately doesn't matter. The player is not allowed to do anything to progress the game except for what Captain Martin Walker inevitably does in this story: mistakenly massacre civilians. Personally, as with Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, I feel that the impact of moments like these is lessened when you come to learn that knowing something was wrong beforehand would not have made any difference. The story is about PTSD and a downward spiral of poor decision-making, but the game is really just about shooting the designated targets as they appear on screen, or else the player makes no progress. And while I understand that developing alternate story routes and gameplay scenarios is by no means easy, I feel there's hardly a better reason to do so than to reward the player for their keen observations and good moral judgment in the midst of deceitful situations that the developers themselves created. There are moments here and there where the player gets to make minor choices, all of which are ultimately inconsequential to the story and do nothing to course correct the main character's downward spiral. But there is one where, after squad member Lugo is lynched by an angry mob, the player may proceed to open fire on the mob, or perhaps they'll think to fire a warning shot to scatter them, although the game does a lot to goad the player into doing the former. But whichever way the situation is handled, the story remains on its track. Captain Walker massacred civilians hours of playtime ago and is well past the point of no return. There is no saving his soul, there's no finding a tactful way out of this mess. We can only watch as Captain Walker continues to spiral out of control. Now, I don't think that this would be that bad if the game treated the story as being separate from the gameplay and outside of the player's control. But unlike Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, Spec Ops: The Line wants the player to think they're to blame for what's happening when they really aren't. The game's characters will practically point at the player themselves and say, "This is your fault." The game will ask if you're feeling like a hero yet. In the game's finale, it looks like your final opponent has his gun aimed at you, the player, when you're choosing whether the main character dies or keeps fighting. Normally, I like to let the art speak for itself. I don't often go looking for development history or staff commentary. If I left it at just the gameplay experience, I would end here by saying that the dissonance between what the game wants me to think I'm responsible for and what I can actually control within the game makes for a frustrating experience for me. And that's the main point I would make about my experience with the game. But I did become interested in what the developers intended because I couldn't infer that myself just by playing their game. Interestingly, the developers said that they had planned an early game option for the player to follow combat orders and leave Dubai, apparently ending the game before any of its ugly twists, but they ended up abandoning that effort. To me, this sounds like a good idea. If done correctly on a first playthrough, leaving the area could be posed as an outlandish choice to make. But in hindsight or on future playthroughs, this outcome would be far preferable to the dark one that is the game's canon ending. It would reward first-time players for their attentiveness, and it would reward anyone for their sound moral judgment, sparing them all of the blame and finger-pointing that the game does later on. It seems to me that the team was at least aware that giving players options not to participate in the game's pivotal massacre would have improved the gameplay experience. Co-writer Walt Williams said that if the player wants to stop this journey, they can stop playing the game. That if the player was horrified after the white phosphorus scene, they could just put the controller down and walk away. But I don't think this is a good design solution to the problem they're posing to the player. This reads as, keep playing the game where you're forced to do immoral deeds even after you're well aware that they're bad. Anything outside of that is not within the realm of our game anymore. Our game only allows you to be a monster for whose actions we will shame and condemn you. He also said that aspects of the game like accusatory loading screens were designed to attack the player, that the game was meant to turn against you the further in you played. So according to him, the intent was very much to shame the player for doing anything other than turning the game off. There are many games out there where playing through them means terrible and unavoidable events play out. But most games don't lay the blame so squarely on the player for merely continuing to play the game, especially when there aren't any choices anyway that the player could make that lead to better outcomes. If the developers of Spec Ops: The Line are going to point the finger at the player for choosing to keep playing a game where awful things happen, the player can just as easily, and perhaps more righteously, point the finger back at the developers for writing an unflinching plotline where awful things happen. I think of No Russian from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 as a similar set piece, but I feel it's a much better example of both writing for shock value and for giving the player a moral choice to make. Being placed in the role of this double agent who is tasked with gunning down innocent civilians is agonizing, but the level is on rails. There is no avoiding its awful outcome. Importantly, you play from a first-person perspective, and the agent you play as never speaks, which I feel puts you in the shoes of this character even better than playing as the hot-headed, loudmouth Captain Walker from a third-person perspective in Spec Ops: The Line. If you are disturbed by the gameplay scenario in No Russian, the game, for one thing, warns you of offensive or disturbing content ahead of the mission, and allows you to skip or disable the level outright without any kind of penalty. And furthermore, you can play through the level without ever pulling the trigger. Makarov and his accomplices will carry out their massacre whether you assist them or not. In the event that the player does assist Makarov, I feel the game could afford to shame them for pulling the trigger, because the player decided to carry out the stated mission and kill civilians, when in fact they could have progressed through the game without doing so. While Spec Ops: The Line is lauded for its moral confrontation of war games and the people who play them, I feel that Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 has it squarely beat here. In a movie, you watch events play out. You're only a spectator. And so you can take in their stories from a removed perspective, just for the satisfaction of witnessing the drama. But games allow you to participate in the experience to varying extents, and you can therefore be implicated in that drama. It can then feel very unfair if there was never really any way for you to affect a negative twist outcome. But some games try anyway to make you feel as if you were inattentive, careless, or immoral. If that was the only outcome anyway, then the player isn't really a factor in the story, and so from a story perspective, they might as well just be watching a movie. In other words, if the story lies outside of the game's interactivity, it just doesn't make sense to treat the player as if they are in any way responsible for how that story unfolds. Alright, well, in spite of having several more ideas for questionable aspects of acclaimed video games to discuss, I will plan on making more installments of the series in the future. The initial idea for this video was more rapid-fire in nature, but the script grew larger than I'd anticipated, and I wanted to give each idea its due. But I also want to try posting fairly regularly, without too long of a gap in my uploads, so I'm calling it here. Please expect more from me in the near future. I may also post shorter videos here and there and try to diversify my subject matter. Thanks for watching, feel free to subscribe and all that if you'd like to keep up with me, and I'll see you later.